Welcome back to Monroe Live, everybody. Before we get started, I want to make an announcement. There's packs of wild, stray dogs roaming the streets of LA. Welcome back to Monroe Live, everybody. Today we have the Kia Niro, the 2023. We have Jordan and myself, Cory. We're going to review the undercarriage of this thing on the Hoist. And Jordan, you've been looking at this for about 5 or 10 minutes, so let's get under here and see what we have to see.
Yeah, plenty of prep time. First thing that catches my eye is, just like many Kias and Hyundai products that we've seen before, just kind of starting from the bottom up here, they've got what looks to be a K-frame from a pre-existing application. And so what I mean by K-frame, it's the subframe that holds the majority of the suspension components, the EDM or the electric drive module, so motor, gearbox, all of that. It's sort of the nexus for all these structural components coming together. But the interesting thing to me on this is you'll see this bracket right here that kind of deadheads into this lower control arm, the forward bushing, and then there's this long member going to the front of the vehicle, this guy right here. Well, it looks like in order to accommodate small overlap rigid barrier, so that's an impact event that IAHS conducts that contacts 25% of the overall vehicle width. It looks like they welded this member on to an existing K-frame. So it's an interesting strategy, and it's got a lot of merit because all of the tooling, all of the design validation testing, everything surrounding this K-frame can be pretty much carryover from the other applications, and then for SORB applications, they're welding this on. Of course, you still need to validate that. You're still going to need to crash the vehicle and make sure that this whole system works. But it's an interesting way to accommodate SORB.
And Jordan, I want to point out one thing. The powertrain, the EDM, is mounted similarly to how internal combustion engines and powertrains are mounted on transverse powertrains. So you have two mounting points up on the rails. So essentially, this whole unit hangs, and then you have this reaction strut. So Jordan, you want to talk about the geometry of this and how this actually varies for other OEMs?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Great point. So yeah, this is acting much like a torque strut. So you can imagine the wheels are spinning this direction, forward and backward, and for every action, there's an equal reaction, right? So as the wheels take torque from the motor, they want to push back at this, and this strut right here, this torque strut is driving into the back end of this. So this is very consistent with what we would see for what we would call a transverse or an east-west configuration on an ICE application. So that means that the axis of the crankshaft is perpendicular with the long axis of the vehicle, or an axis with Y if you spin CAD. So this would be a transverse setup. Now in a longitudinal setup, the torque coming out of the motor is also perpendicular, right? So the entire powertrain mount and orientation typically changes. So typically you'd have two mounts on the side, significantly lower typically, often mounted directly to the cradle. And then in the rear, right, so where you've got a bell housing and a transmission coming back on a longitudinal application, you would have one cross-car support that typically ties into the tunnel.
Yeah. And up here, let's point out some of the smaller features that we see. Now, Eric, you want to come around here? So you have a plate heat exchanger, which is going to interface with the gear oil of the EDM and then your ethylene glycol of your thermal system. Right here, this looks to be a chiller based on the fact that we can see it's interfacing between the ethylene glycol and the refrigerant, most likely R1234YF. Now, this is a huge improvement over what we saw on our other Kia Niro that we got, I think, a year and a half ago, particularly the compactness of the routing of the lines. They moved a lot of stuff over here so that there's no lines running all the way to this side. They have a hard-mounted, high-voltage AC compressor that is mounted higher up, and it looks like the lines are running up and back instead of down and around. So something that I criticized pretty heavily was the inefficiency of the routing of the aluminum lines for the thermal system. It looks like they've taken a step in the right direction. Also, quick connects are used to jump from item to item, and their links are relatively short from this plate exchanger to this chiller. But one thing that is still kind of baffles me, they're using the quick connects for manufacturing, but then they still have constant tension spring clamps holding the EPDM or rubber hose onto the quick connect. Like if you're going to commit to the quick connect, you might as well go with nylon lines that are shrunk to it, similar to this one. So you have a nylon line, probably PA12, which are PA12 that are essentially, I don't know whether it's a heat staking or a heat shrink operation to that, right, Jordan?
Yeah, absolutely. And great observations. And one thing that I found interesting, even as you were explaining that, is the selective use of EPDM, so like the more rubberized hose, and the PA12. So they only have a couple of the PA12 hoses in their system, apparently. They have one up over coming off of the chiller as well. And one thing that I've seen on a few OEMs, and confirmed it with them, where they selectively started to add PA12 lines into their system, they were actually trialing those lines versus the more conventional EPDM, which are sort of tried and true.
And VW was having some problems with some of their EPDM lines because they were kinking. And what do you notice right here, Jordan? Feel that.
It's a pretty severe kink.
It's got a kink in it.
It sure does.
So this is exactly how it came out of came onto the lift, and this is kinked.
Yeah, and I would be willing to bet, Corey, seeing this kink, that this line is probably in violation of some minimum bend radii of that hose.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you were to talk to anyone who's designing for these hoses, right, we have a lot of packaging discussions with clients, right? Anytime we get into the EPDM, high voltage, anything ductile, almost everything has minimum bend radii, meaning I can't make a curve within this whatever radius based on the diameter of the hose, the type of the hose, and so forth. So this may be in violation of that.
This video is sponsored by Detroit Denim. Detroit Denim offers made-to-order quality garments to fit you perfectly, get better with age, and can be repaired. Great jeans start with great materials, and Detroit Denim takes exceptional care in sourcing high-quality fabrics, threads, and hardware. They approach sustainability from two angles: production and consumption. Detroit Denim uses a lean manufacturing philosophy. Like a vehicle JIT supplier, just in time, they produce less by never making a pair of jeans until a customer asks for it. This means zero waste from overproduction. Detroit Denim helps you consume less by creating heirloom quality garments designed to be a versatile and meaningful addition to your wardrobe. You don't need a lot of jeans. You really just need a few great pairs. Go to DetroitDenim.com and book your virtual fitting today. Get 10% off your first order using the discount code Monroe.
Now this is essentially pretty much the opposite of what we saw with the Rivian. The Rivian was super high feature, not for the thermal system, but for the layout of the drivetrain. And I talked about center versus offset. This is an offset system. The motor's right here. Your gearbox is offset to the left side of the car. What that means is you have this little transfer shaft. So the transfer shaft goes from the output of the differential right there, and then you get output of the differential, and then you get to this point, and then this point is in the similar location as the left side for your CV axle. Now the Rivian was in the center, and they had their suspension connection points much further inboard to about right here, which allowed for better travel. And with that better travel, it's only enabled by the fact that they had the output for the left and right CV axle very far inboard, which allowed for better geometry of the CV axles.
Yeah.
Now, Jordan, you want to talk about the suspension a little bit? A little more high feature than we're typically used to out of the Korean OEMs. So it looks like you have a forged knuckle, very fine details, thin sections with only 3 fasteners securing the hub to the knuckle, and the fasteners are also very lightweight. I love to see internal torques because that means the bolt is very light.
Yeah.
If you want to maximize your weight reduction, especially in an area that is unsprung weight, go with lightweight bolts choices.
Yeah,
so I love that.
Absolutely, I'm with you. And you know, the Germans were really the first to start implementing those in mass volume, right? So if you were to look at any BMW, Mercedes application, VW.
Usually triple square is
Right.
what they use for those.
Right.
And just like the Rivian video, if you didn't watch the R1S video, the Rivian had these super expensive aluminum fixed caliper, 6-piston Brembo brakes. And I said, man, if you just had a Korean OEM, it would be a cast iron single piston sliding caliper.
Right. And a lot of OEMs don't like the single piston caliper because it doesn't give you the same performance. So with a 2-piston, either they will vary the diameters of the 2 pistons, still being a floated caliper, so that, you know, if you consider the primary direction of the rotor, one will be like a first lead-in, so it'll be like a smaller piston, a smaller diameter piston, and then they'll have a larger one that really helps with the clamp. And what you get in effect is a more uniformed clamp load from the caliper to the rotor itself. And so that's going to manifest in terms of better braking performance, feedback to the pedal, and ultimately longevity of your rotor as well, because you're consistently using the full swept area or that like shiny part on the rotor.
All right, Jordan, let's get into the battery because, you know, this is an EV. It's a primarily aluminum structure. One thing that immediately struck me was the one-way fasteners here. These are security fasteners. So you're able to secure these fasteners in, but they actually have relief, so they're very difficult to get off. This is securing the bottom aluminum portion of the battery pack, which you can see in and out. It creates the bottom half of the thermal system. Is that right, Jordan? You want to show that?
Yeah, so you can see, as Cory was pointing out, this bottom plate, there's some like proud features here, and then you see the coolant lines going in and out right here. So it appears like, and we'd only be able to confirm this by actually dropping this, that the entire bottom of the pack is also sandwiching in the coolant routed that's actually accepting the rejection, the heat rejection from the batteries themselves. So not the first time that we've seen that type of application. The VW ID4, I know, executed something very similar to this. There are trade-offs, right? Some OEMs like to, protect their coolant relative to the battery space. So kind of interesting.
Yeah. And the leading edge of this battery is slightly more protected than the other Kia and Hyundai vehicles we saw, particularly the difference between the height of this in Z and the height of this in Z. I still don't like the fact that this is below. The cinder block test, let's say you run over a cinder block going down the freeway at 70 miles an hour, there still is a few plastic aero shields. I see them right there over on the ground. You don't have to show them. Which will protect a little bit, but you have a low voltage harness exposed right here. Your high voltage harness is very well protected. It's way up here above, any sort of damage line. But if you took a cinder block to this edge right here, you could split open your thermal system, but the connectors are kind of protected. They're up there. It's something that we always look for, particularly because some of the early Teslas had problems where they would run over stuff and I think they would pierce the front of the battery pack. I think they even added a small titanium protective plate to protect some area. And it's something that we, try and observe when we're looking at these things.
Yeah. The other couple of observations that I noted while looking at the bottom of this, they've got these two stamped closeout panels here. This is something that, if we typically advise against. Anytime you're putting holes in the underside of a battery pack that are leading directly to where the cells or the electronics are packaged, we typically advise against it from the underside simply because you're introducing leak paths. Anytime you've got a hole or a flange or anything like that, it's a leak path to the battery. Water and battery don't typically mix well in terms of shorting, but this is advantageous from a service perspective. So if likely in here you've got your contactors, probably high voltage fuses, if you do need to service those, and within a battery pack those are the most probable failure points, you can drop those panels and service them without dropping the whole pack. However, we would typically advise hey, let's design the system such that In the event of a failure, it's so catastrophic, we're replacing the whole pack anyways. So essentially non-serviceable packs. There's a lot of advantages to doing that.
And there's a slight disadvantage to aerodynamics. If this is the bottom of the car, even these fasteners and these tiny lips causes some disturbance in the flow versus a completely flat surface. So for aero, you want it to be completely flat, and even this will affect it a little bit, like these access holes in these panels.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other observation just from the underside of the pack is they've got center of floor. It looks like they have 5 primary bolts that are likely going all the way through the battery pack and into what you'd probably find as a sectional area in the body structure. So this is sort of always an interesting discussion, or where do you want to put your structure? Do you want your battery pack to provide supplemental floor structure for your body, or do you want your body to provide all the structure and the battery pack essentially just hang from it? So it's hard to say just by looking here which strategy they elected to go with, or if they split it 50-50, but they do have like intra pack fasteners going to the floor.
Yeah. So Jordan, you said you saw on the label for the battery, they're not only labeling the kilowatt hours, 64.8 kilowatt hours, but there's a mass, 420 kilograms. Now, you can do a gravimetric calculation. Did you do that beforehand? What's it at?
Yeah, so this one is just under 70 watt hours per pound.
Per pound.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so to put that in perspective, the 4680 pack, which many people, will air quote say structural pack, and so they omitted a lot of features and but a lot of features or components that are likely in this pack, is like 64.5 watt hours per pound. Now, the key difference here, though, is the Model Y also includes their DC to DC converter. From what I can tell, the BMS, or the battery management system, the computer, the logic, is in the top front side of this pack as well, but this doesn't have the DC to DC computer. But I would say, as far as energy density, right, as it relates to weight and overall package, it does seem to be a relatively weight and energy efficient pack.
Yeah, and here's the best telltale sign that they're repurposing an internal combustion engine platform. Look at all the space underneath the seat in here. You could fit a family of raccoons in there. And that's where the fuel tank went, and most likely you have packaging room for exhaust system as well. And now you have these huge steel stanchions that reach up to actually reach a point to secure to the body. If this was a EV only platform, the vehicle would be designed in such a way that you wouldn't have all that wasted space. I mean, look at it, it's like a little cubby hole in there.
Yeah, great observation. And these are not, it's maybe difficult to pick up on camera, these are not thin brackets. Those are probably every bit of 2.5 to 3 millimeters thick. So it's a substantial amount of weight that you're adding. Yeah, Cory, the other thing that I saw, and I'm looking at now even, is on that label it says Webasto. Mm-hmm. So that to me is saying that Hyundai Kia is actually
outsourcing.
They're outsourcing the assembly, the final buildup of this whole pack module to Webasto, so they're not doing it in-house.
Webasto's an integrator. I mean, they'll build up sub-assemblies of existing parts, but they also, I think, are a tier 1 supplier of some components. But yeah, it's a good catch there. The rear suspension of this is as basic as it gets. Essentially a stamped steel stamped steel isolated rear cradle, and you also have stamped steel components for 1, 2, 3 of your cross car suspension links, and then you have, they call this a flex, I forget what.
Twist blade.
A twist blade, sorry, yeah, not a flex blade, a twist blade. And only 2 bolts here on the twist blade, really efficient. Sometimes you'll see OEMs with 3. This isn't even welded, which is really efficient. So oftentimes you'll have to weld this for strength. The upper one is probably welded, and it is, because it's a more unique geometry. So when it comes to just basic suspension system, this is it. This is what you get. And I see you just have a EPB with a cast iron brake caliper, 3 bolts for the rear hub assembly, and wheel speed sensor on the hub.
Yeah. Yeah, in terms of cost, it's about as low cost as you're going to go, right? For one key area, they said we're going to go cast aluminum knuckle, but outside of that, it doesn't get much less expensive as far as rear suspensions go, unless you go twist beam, which we've seen. So a twist beam, instead of having a cradle, you've got a massive structural member that actually floats and carries the springs, but that also connects to bushings in the leading edge of that. The downside of a twist beam, which is really the only lower cost option in terms of suspension, is it starts to impede in your battery package space. So you take the leading edge of a beam and it would want to live roughly in the same area where they're now able to bring some of their energy storage.
Yeah. So at Monroe, we get opportunity to review dozens of EVs every year, and they range all the way from this vehicle, which is a relatively low cost Korean-made electric vehicle, all the way to that Rivian R1S, which we just had. And one thing I want to point out is Kia has figured out how to manufacture vehicles. The Rivian we had thousands of paint marks all over the vehicle. The cradle, every single weld had, I think, 2 or 3 check marks. Now, come in here, you can see where they did check with the paint mark. A critical fastener at the final assembly would be the bolt connecting the stabilizer bar to the stabilizer link. They're checking to make sure the spring is seated, maybe the shock is bolted or in. There's a little bit of paint mark here to make sure it got seated there. There's a paint mark on this point right there, but it's few and far between. So once you have your processes so repeatable, the need to have arduous amounts of checks drops, and you'll see them only where needed to ensure that the vehicle goes out and it's very safe. These critical safety bolts to make sure they're going through so that your wheels aren't falling off like Toyota had that problem.
Yeah, and then the only other observation that I would make on the rear suspension is they have mass dampers on both of these lower control arms. So anytime we see this, right, throughout the development cycle, they're going through some form of validation, and they found that they could not cancel out some frequency or mode. And so ultimately, they just bolted on mass dampers. So it's kind of a bummer when you have to do it as an OEM, right? You've got this super lean, efficient suspension, as Cory was talking about, thin gauge, stamped steel, low-cost components, and then you have to go and bolt on some mass dampers. But sometimes that's just how it goes.
And my question for the viewers, do you care? When you buy an EV, do you care that your suspension components are low cost? Or do you want that beautiful high feature, high dollar componentry with extra range of travel and the ability to go rock crawling in Moab and compete with the best of them? So when you're deciding on the EV that's right for you, this may not matter. If you want to drive back and forth to school, get a couple hundred miles of range, was that 250 or something? Yeah. This is a perfectly reasonable vehicle. Is it something I would drive? Absolutely not. What about you, Jordan?
Wouldn't be my first pick, but you got to hand it to them in terms of getting something like this into production at the rate that they have, right? There's not, a lot of startups out there. We see a lot of vehicles that are just coming to market, and you get to see in terms of the components, as Cory was alluding to with the inspections, but even down to the actual weld seams, the quality of the welds, the quality of the build, the attention to detail. It is impressive looking at Hyundai, Kia, how far they've come in how short of time. But yeah, not my first vehicle pick.
All right, I think that pretty much sums it up for our review of this Kia Niro. Thanks everybody for watching. We also want to give a shout out to Detroit Denim. I'm wearing my Detroit Denim jeans. I really love them. Jordan's are being made. He hasn't received his yet, so don't show his jeans. We want to thank them for sponsoring all of our talent on Monroe & Associates. We really appreciate the support that they provide. And that's all I have. Anything else, Jordan?
Nope, that's all. Thank you.
All right, bye.